Unlocking the queen's diagonal immediately pressures the center and opens lines for swift piece development. Developing the knight to a central square immediately sets up potential queenside pressure and prepares for king's Indian defense structures. Asserting central influence, this thrust immediately contests the d5 square and prepares kingside development for unleashed pressure. Embracing the fianchetto, black prepares for long-term kingside pressure and a flexible pawn structure. Developing the knight to f3 reinforces central control and prepares for kingside castling, a natural continuation. Solidifying the fianchetto creates a robust defensive structure, preparing for potential central pawn breaks or kingside expansion. Solidifying the kingside structure, this prepares for a timely fianchetto and central pawn advance, aiming for a comfortable positional grip. Solidifying the pawn chain and preparing for a d5 push, this pawn advance secures the structure for future development. Solidifying the center and preparing to castle, this bishop anchors the kingside pawn chain and eyes potential queenside expansion. Embracing central control, black ignites a dynamic pawn thrust, challenging white's spatial advantage and initiating a complex positional struggle. Unleashing the queen here immediately aims to disrupt black's central pawn structure by threatening the d5 pawn, creating immediate pressure and potentially forcing awkward defensive moves. Securing the monarch is paramount, and this castling maneuver safely tucks the king away behind a robust pawn shield, initiating a crucial defensive consolidation that prepares for future middle-game skirmishes. Securing the monarch amidst this developing fianchetto structure allows white to prepare for central pawn advances and potential kingside pressure without immediate tactical concerns. Challenging the queen's outpost creates immediate tension, forcing a decision about who relocates next and potentially opening lines for future activity. Solidifying the center and preparing further queenside expansion, this piece claims vital central squares and eyes the queenside pawn structure, creating potential for future dynamic play. Recentering the rook on the d-file after the queen's earlier excursion brings crucial defensive support, preparing to contest this vital central artery and potentially liberating the a8 pawn for more dynamic central action later. Carving out space on the queenside now puts immediate pressure on black's queenside pawn structure and limits the activity of the queen and potentially future maneuvers. This advance aggressively stakes a claim and forces black to react, possibly compromising their development or piece coordination to address the encroaching pawn. Unburdening the queenside immediately simplifies the position, potentially creating a more manageable middle game structure for black, even if it relinquishes some immediate queenside counterplay. This exchange aims to clarify black's strategic goals, possibly focusing on rapid piece development and the eventual control of central files. Exposing the queenside pawn structure, white aims to gain long-term influence over the file and hinder black's queenside piece development, creating a subtle but persistent positional disadvantage. Reclaiming the initiative on the queenside with this knight repositioning, a nuanced attempt to both bolster the queenside pawn structure and challenge white's central control, aiming to free the blockade on the file and perhaps target the isolated b3 pawn later. Positioning the bishop on f4 significantly enhances white's queenside presence, projecting power towards black's central pawns and creating potential attacking avenues. Seeking to reroute the knight to a more active square, nd7 intends to prepare the eventual jump to c5, challenging white's advanced pawn chain and potentially disrupting the queenside structure. This maneuver highlights black's proactive approach to imbalances, aiming to trade off the doubled pawns on the queenside for more dynamic play. The knight's repositioning also clears the way for the b-pawn to advance, adding another piece to the queenside battle. Consider the long-term consequences of this knight's journey. Its potential impact on the c5 square and the open a file is significant for the ensuing middle game. The rook, now active on the third rank, prepares to exert pressure along the file, potentially disrupting black's queenside structure and targeting the exposed c6 pawn if it were to advance. A bold maneuver, this f6, challenges the central pawn structure and seeks to disrupt white's queenside pressure, though it does weaken the dark squares around the king. Black is gambling for counterplay, aiming to open lines for their pieces and potentially unearth a tactical opportunity. This pawn push signals a shift in black's strategic intentions, moving away from passive defense towards more active, albeit risky, engagement. Consider the long-term implications for pawn weaknesses and the safety of your monarch. Launching this pawn aggressively into the center immediately seizes crucial central squares, aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure and potentially open lines for white's rooks and queen. This bold pawn thrust injects immediate dynamism into the game, forcing black to react and potentially creating tactical opportunities by challenging the e6 pawn and its support. It signals a clear intention to fight for central space and initiative, possibly leading to a more open and tactical middle game where pawn breaks become critical. Shedding the central pawn opens a path for black's pieces, particularly the queen's rook, and aims to disrupt white's intended queenside expansion. It's a calculated risk to inject dynamic play rather than passively enduring white's spatial advantage. Reclaiming the knight to a more central square, white's forces begin to assert pressure on the queenside, aiming to exploit black's slightly awkward pawn structure, particularly the doubled pawns on the c-file which, while controlled for now, represent a long-term weakness. This central knight presence also prepares for potential pawn breaks in the center, or a repositioning to attack the kingside if black isn't careful. Shifting the knight to f8, a seemingly passive retreat, aims to liberate the g7 bishop and potentially redeploy the knight to a more active square like e6 or even g6, bypassing the current blockade on the kingside. This maneuver is a subtle, long-term repositioning rather than an immediate tactical assault, seeking to improve piece harmony after white's aggressive pawn push created imbalances. Black is prioritizing structural solidity and potential counterplay on the queen side, hoping to outmaneuver the opponent's slightly more advanced pawn structure. Re-establishing knight presence in the center, this repositioning aims to both contest the d5 square and prepare for potential advances on the king side. Instead of allowing black's pieces to coordinate freely on the queen side, white seeks to re-engage in the central struggle. The knight, having been temporarily sidelined, now aims to become an active participant, potentially eyeing the e4 or c4 squares depending on black's response. This subtle shift signifies white's intention to avoid passive play and actively seek counterplay. This knight maneuver is less about immediate tactical threats and more about reinforcing positional control and setting up future attacking possibilities. It's a quiet piece of positional maneuvering that could blossom into something more significant if black isn't vigilant. The flexibility gained by bringing the knight back into the fray is a valuable asset for white. Solidifying the central presence, e6 initiates a strategic repositioning aimed at challenging white's advanced pawn on c5 and preparing for potential kingside activity, while also offering a safe haven for the knight should the e-file become contested. Reclaiming the initiative on the queen side, the bishop now aims to occupy the vital diagonal that was previously controlled by black's queen, preparing for potential pressure down the a1h8 diagonal. A bold maneuver, this knight ventures into enemy territory, aiming to disrupt white's newly consolidated pawn structure on the queen side and potentially leverage the open file. It challenges the bishop's long diagonal and creates tactical possibilities, forcing white to consider immediate responses rather than continuing with their positional development plans. This knight's presence could become a thorn in white's side, potentially leading to exchanges or forcing concessions. The rook pivots to the edge, a calculated gamble to challenge the queenside pawn majority by eyeing the potentially isolated pawn. Striking at the white queen and aiming to disrupt the pawn structure is a bold, albeit risky maneuver, creating immediate tactical complications. Reclaiming the crucial c-file with this rook shift immediately challenges black's ambitious knight on c2, forcing a decision about its precarious placement and potentially opening avenues for white's own rooks to become active on the central files. Shattering the symmetry, black dramatically disrupts white's rook activity on the file, initiating a cascade of exchanges that promises to clarify the board's character. Opening the f-file now grants considerable attacking potential against black's king, but it simultaneously exposes your own monarch to potential future threats from black's pieces. Bringing the knight back to c7 cleverly addresses the potential vulnerability on the queen side while also preparing to redeploy the piece for more active service, possibly towards the d5 square or even the central e6 outpost, aiming to disrupt white's consolidated pawn structure and potentially prepare pawn breaks of its own. Reclaiming the initiative on the king side, this bishop repositions to a more active diagonal, aiming to support potential pawn advances and develop latent threats against black's somewhat passive setup. Restoring the king to a more active central role is a prudent step, allowing it to support the e-pawn's advance and potentially join the defense of the queenside pawns should the opportunity arise, while also creating a pathway for the remaining rook. Repositioning the bishop to c4 immediately puts pressure on black's queenside pawns, particularly the c7 pawn, while also eyeing the vulnerable kingside. White is clearly aiming to exploit the slightly misplaced knight on b4 and create further imbalances. This maneuver demonstrates a keen understanding of piece activity and the need to challenge black's pawn structure before it solidifies. The bishop's new diagonal offers active prospects, potentially forcing concessions from black or preparing for a more aggressive central advance later. Unlocking the bishop's potential along the a7-g1 diagonal is the immediate ambition behind this maneuver, aiming to create threats and disrupt white's seemingly solid queenside structure. Shifting the king towards the center isn't just about king safety anymore. It's a crucial step in preparing the g-pawn's advance and unlocking the bishop on g2, hinting at a potential regrouping of forces for a queenside initiative. Undermining white's queenside expansion with a pawn thrust, black boldly challenges the c5 pawn and aims to create imbalances. Opening up the c-file offers a dynamic confrontation, forcing a rapid reevaluation of piece placement. Reclaiming that pawn is paramount, establishing a more equitable distribution of material and opening a pathway for your rook to become actively involved along the now accessible file, even if temporarily. Liberating the file is a significant material concession in exchange for open lines. The immediate outcome of the exchange simplifies the pawn structure and brings an active rook into play, aiming to exploit weaknesses. This decision fundamentally alters the board's dynamic, shifting the focus from rigid positional play to a more fluid, tactical contest where control of open files becomes paramount. Consider how this redeployment might pressure black's slightly disorganized queenside, potentially creating targets where none existed before. Reclaiming the rook and reinforcing the queenside pawn majority creates an immediate positional challenge for white, aiming to activate the piece and potentially contest the now open d-file. Unlocking the queenside majority, this pawn push aims to establish a formidable connected passed pawn structure, threatening to advance deep into black's territory and create significant endgame advantages. The monarch steps out of the shadows, initiating a crucial maneuver to connect its rooks and prepare for active participation in the central struggle, aiming to exploit white's potentially vulnerable doubled pawns on the kingside. Asserting dominion over the central squares, white boldly advances, aiming to shatter black's defensive structure and unlock potential tactical opportunities through pawn expansion on the queenside. Reclaiming a pawn opens up lines for your rook, aiming to infiltrate the queenside structure and generate counterplay. Seizing the open b-file with the knight offers a dynamic tempo gain, threatening to infiltrate black's queenside structure and exploit the weak b6 pawn. Reclaiming the knight is an absolute necessity, as leaving it en prize would be a tactical blunder of catastrophic proportions. The pawn structure is now significantly disrupted, creating potential weaknesses for both sides to exploit. Clearing the bishop allows for a decisive material advantage and simplifies into a winning endgame by capturing the defender of the crucial central pawn. Shifting the king to the center now is a bold decision, essentially embracing the chaos of potential skirmishes on the open files that will inevitably arise as those pawns march forward. Consolidating control of the long diagonal by repositioning the bishop offers a vital outpost for the piece, aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure and prepare for potential advances on the kingside. Consolidating the bishop to a safer square initiates a strategic repositioning, aiming to establish a more active role and potentially threaten white's compromised queenside structure. Unlocking the kingside by clearing the bishop's path from the shadows offers a dynamic attacking potential. Addressing the defensive posture and potential king exposure, this placement aims to prevent immediate threats and subtly reinforce the kingside pawn structure, offering a much-needed breathing room. A strategic retreat to the 7th rank activates the bishop, bringing it closer to the central action and preparing to eye weaknesses around black's king. A daring gambit to activate the slumbering kingside pawns and create active counterplay, though it risks exposing the monarch further. Unlocking the central tension is paramount. Pushing this pawn forward aims to disrupt black's pawn chain and potentially open lines for white's own pieces, creating dynamic possibilities. Unleashing the f-pawn creates immediate tension in the center, challenging white's pawn structure and threatening to open lines. Exposing the king further, this captures the pawn, but opens the f-file and creates potential infiltration points for black's pieces as the game simplifies. Recapturing the bishop reestablishes a pawn presence, but critically, it opens the f-file, a significant opportunity for black's rook to become active and potentially penetrate white's defenses. The king is still somewhat exposed, and this recapture might invite further complications. The rook lunges forward, aiming to seize control of the c-file and potentially disrupt black's king's safety, while simultaneously threatening the isolated b-pawn, a clear signal of white's aggressive intentions to create immediate tactical headaches for the opponent. A daring gambit emerges as black's pawn boldly advances, creating a central pawn storm that demands immediate attention and potentially unlocks attacking avenues or strategically sacrifices material for initiative. Shifting the knight to d2 aims to reroute it, perhaps towards the more active squares like c4 or e4, while also defending the vulnerable e4 pawn and potentially preparing for a kingside pawn push later, seeking to exploit the slightly misplaced black king. Reclaiming the pawn offers a vital foothold and creates immediate complications for white's centralized pieces, forcing a response to protect the d4 square and potentially disrupting its coordinated attack.